So good morning and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alex Vines. I'm Director of the Africa Programme here at Chatham House. And I'm hosting today this meeting on a year on from Nigeria's 2023 elections. As you know, in Nigeria, there were elections this time last year, and President Bola Ahmed Tinubu assumed power following a contested electoral process that saw voter turnout at just 25.7%. And then there have been subsequent legal challenges from his opponents. These presidential, legislative, and gubernatorial elections faced many challenges, including technological failures of the BVAS system and also the viewing portal by INEC, the IReV. Yet there are lessons to draw from Nigeria's 2023 elections, which come in a context of elections that have been seriously contested and disputed in the ECOWAS region of West Africa. We've had contested elections in Sierra Leone. We've had an election that has been applauded in Liberia. And there's been plenty of drama recently around elections in Senegal that are coming up and needed a ruling by the Constitutional Council of Senegal. So the job today is to talk a little bit about the most populous country in West Africa, Nigeria, which its electorate could swallow up the rest of the region, basically, and then draw out what does that mean for the rest of the region. There's plenty of pessimism in the global north about the state of democracy in West Africa. There are articles in newspapers talking about that democracy and political pluralism is on the retreat. Yet the reality is that we see all sorts of different things happening in the West African region. You have democratic advances, as we've seen in Liberia, and then you've had contestation, as we saw in Sierra Leone and more recently in Senegal. And of course, we'll maybe refer to also where there have been clear-cut democratic reversals through coups, for example, and Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger in particular come to mind. This is a year of more elections in West Africa. So there will be elections, local level elections taking place in Togo. And obviously later this year, there will be an important election in Ghana, in addition to the one that I've just referenced in Senegal that is coming up pretty soon. So my job here is both to introduce speakers to you, but I will make some remarks also about the Commonwealth Observer Group to Nigeria, of which I was part of, to observe the elections that occurred this time last year. Unfortunately, the Commonwealth Observer Group on Nigeria report was meant to be ready for today, but bureaucracy in the Commonwealth Secretariat means that it still needs to go through its quality control process to its final destination and be released. So I think it's imminent, and it is a record Commonwealth Observer report. So I don't think even ECOWAS can compete with 102 recommendations. So we'll hear from Ambassador Abdel Fattah Musa, but that is how many recommendations are in the report. I can confirm that because I've counted them all. And so the report talks about all sorts of things, the use of technology, ballot papers, communication strategy of INEC, voter turnout, participation inclusion, rule of party agents, security, secrecy of the ballot, situation rooms, and close and count. All of these have significant sections in that report. The report does reflect also on legislation in Nigeria, the new Electoral Act, for example, of 2022, which represented a significant change in the legislative framework and built on past recommendations. So all of those will be in the Commonwealth Observer Group report that will come out, and we'll make sure at Chatham House that everybody who has registered for this meeting will get the link to that report when it's ready. I think it's about a week away. I think it's also Commonwealth Week, and I think that's also added to the slowness of signing these things off. So I had the privilege of being in Nigeria for the elections, as I said. I was actually myself stationed in the north of the country in Sokoto. I saw myself the challenges of Nigeria, but also its strengths, the importance of civil society in particular. The organizations like the former one that Idiat Hassan was involved in, the CDD, and the work that they did around their their situation room and providing quality information, including to observer groups like the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth Observer Group was small. It deployed to Nigeria on the 18th of February. And we departed on the 2nd of March, having finalized a draft report. Our observers were deployed across the country on where it was safe to deploy. So the Federal Capital Territory, Benue, Edo, Kano, Lagos, Ondo, Rivers, and Sokoto, which I've mentioned. And then drew on the local observers and other organizations, such as African Union and particularly ECOWAS. The ECOWAS interim statement was a robust one, and I do observe that one of the things that happened in 2023 is that you had more robust interim statements by the regional economic community than many other observer groups, both in Nigeria, but also if you look closely, you'll see the same thing happen further south. The Southern African Development Community interim statement on the Zimbabwe elections. So I think that's also something to think about how regional economic communities are actually becoming more assertive in terms of their statements around elections and what they observe. The other thing that was impressive was that the economic community of West African states, whereas the Commonwealth only focused on the presidential and legislative elections, the ECOWAS focused also and deployed on the gubernatorial, the state elections, for example. And it strikes me in Nigeria that's always been one of the weaknesses, that international observers all depart in haste often and don't stay for a much more lengthy process. So they often pre-deploy, but then they leave alone the gubernatorial elections. And my own impression is that there were plenty of problems in the presidential legislative elections, but there were all sorts of additional challenges in the gubernatorial ones, and I hope we kind of reflect on that. So I'm not going to say anything more now, but open up to our speakers. And our first speaker is Idiat Hassan, who's the non-resident Senior Associate Fellow for the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. But previously, she served as the director for the Center for Democracy and Development. She has led research teams in cutting-edge analysis on social media's role, the challenges of insecurity, transitional justice opportunities. And for this purposes, as I've mentioned, she was really key in playing a role of coordinating the CDD Election Analysis Center and liaising with ECOWAS, African Union, the Commonwealth Secretariat, and many others. I was very lucky and privileged also after the election to co-author an expert comment with Idiat that we published on the Chatham House website, drawing on her in-depth expertise and observation inside Nigeria in the run-up and after the elections, but also from the observations that we gained from the Commonwealth Group and my time in Nigeria. So with no more ado, I'll hand over to you, Idiat, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Alex, and it's a pleasure to be reflecting 1 year after on this very important, but possibly the most fractious Nigerian elections since the 1979 elections. Like, it's the most difficult, and it shares some of the similarities with the Nigerian 1979 presidential elections in particular. But today I've decided to reflect, starting with the positive, before going to the key conclusions and to challenges experienced in the elections. And I think one of the most important positives to start from is that from these last elections, Nigeria actually moved from a duopoly, a two-party state of the People's Democratic Party and the All Progressive Party, to Congress, All Progressive Congress, APC, to now a party, to now a democracy where we have 9 out of the 18 political parties occupying one seat or the other in government. So that is like 50% of our 18 existing political parties are actually in government. And I think one of the key things to note is that also in the presidential elections, the 2 vote banks of Nigeria, Kano and Lagos, were actually won by third-party candidates. I think that is a first. Lagos being won by the Labour Party and Kano won by the New Nigerian People's Party, NNPP itself. While 5 different parties currently hold governorship seats and 9 legislative places, 7 in Senate, 8 in the House of Representatives, and 9 in the State House of Representatives, with a tablecloth of political parties in play here. 2, and importantly, is also youth participation. While it did not eventually reflect in the voter turnout, the voter registration actually made us to see how big the youth power and the demography and opportunities for the future they represent, possibly leaning on the NSAS protest and mobilization itself. 3rd and important is that for most analysts, there was a reflection, there was an expectation that actually the election is going to end on the streets, not in the courts, and that the likelihood of a post-election violence hacking to what we experienced in 2011 with more than 700 people killed would replicate in 2023. But fortunately for us, instead of moving to the street, the parties actually moved to the courts itself, irrespective of what might have actually happened. And I think lastly is that it was also important and very a positive development for us that we saw incumbents being defeated. We saw governors who lorded over a whole state, unable to win 1/3 of those states, as reflected in the senatorial seats, which is like 1/3 of a state. They won the elections to be a governor over a whole state, but could not win just 1/3 of those states. And that was reflected across board, with more than 7 governors, incumbents lose the opportunity to be in the Senate. So at least these are like some of the positives we should highlight when we come to the elections. But there are very key conclusions which are quite important, not just for electioneering in Nigeria, but for Nigeria itself as an entity, which these elections have brought up and made very, very sacrosanct itself. One, and very important, is the role identity plays here. And by identity, identity is a very fluid one in Nigeria. It's a fluid concept. 1 minute, I'm a Southwesterner, a Yoruba, a Muslim. You assume the one as it actually suits you, and a woman here. And this fluidity of identity, we saw it in the last elections. But what was very key was the role religion and ethnic identity actually played in the lead up to the election and actually in the outcome of the election itself. And what is also reflecting here with the kind of divide and the bifurcation of the elections beyond the rhetorics of some of the actors in these elections. This was the elections where we saw identity reflected, like we had an ethnic vote, a geography at the end of the day, where everybody, all the presidential candidates actually won big. It was an ethnic vote map. You have the APC candidate winning 54% in the Southwest, where he hails from. The PDP candidate, Atiku Abubakar, won 50%, and 5 out of the 6 states in his native Northeast. The LP candidate actually won I think around 87% in the southeast of the state where he hailed from. It was really at the end of the day, a ethnic vote map that we had, not a national one. One thing we could not actually see up till date was the role demography played, even though we knew without having numbers that youth is not a monolith. They are an heterogeneous group, and identity cuts in here. The experience of the youth in the northern part of the country differs from the youth in the southern part of the country, and obviously they voted the same way. The second key conclusion was the role violence played and will continue to play as an instrument by the political parties. We saw violence being instrumentalized both online and offline in this instance. We saw violence, and I think violence at the end of the day impugned the character of the elections more than we have even bothered to delve into, with voter suppression, voter intimidation, theft of election materials being seen. And in fact, in the subnational elections, where we see elections are local, really, violence was extremely instrumentalized to determine the outcome of these elections. And the political class do hold the monopoly of violence itself, with voters, election officials all being prime victims of these elections. And it's worrying that year in, year after, maybe when the Commonwealth report will come out, all the reports that were issued after the elections talked about the establishment of an electoral offenses tribunal or commission to immediately deal with the issue of violence as a deterrence and also as a way of promoting accountability. But since 2010, we've been talking about this. We are yet to see it happen. Institutions are key in these elections. And by institutions, it goes beyond the election management body. But for instance, we saw the role of the security agencies and the least expected, the Central Bank of Nigeria played in determining the elections itself. When you saw the policies that was introduced few weeks into the elections by the CBN actually helped not just to poison the polity, but also created difficulty in terms of running these elections, even for observer groups or even international observers here, where in most places, they do not accept the foreign credit card. How do they even pay for their own basics? I think this had a way of actually skewing the elections. But what is very key to note here is that trust in an institution is completely missing. And this trust, the lack of trust in institution, the lack of trust in the Independent National Electoral Commission itself created a perception, a challenge where the acceptance of electoral outcome, especially with a narrow margin, became like an impossibility for the people. And I think without the absence of trust remains extremely a challenge we will need to grapple with, because it's also the trust that will impact on turnout at the end of the day. Is when you trust the system, you feel like going under the scorching sun to participate in this, regardless of what's happened. I think the fourth one is technology, which Professor Nena will actually be talking about in depth. Technology was actually sold as a silver bullet to Nigerians. The integrity of the elections was hinged on the technology of the BVAS and the INEC result viewing platform. I think a post-election, a post-mortem of the elections eventually showed that the BVAS worked. And where it did not work, it was the RAC techs actually came within 30 minutes to fix it. And we could look at it and say that the kind of humongous numbers that was previously turned out in previous elections did not happen in these elections. For instance, when you look at the history of the voting pattern in a state like Borno State, in 2015, they gave like 900,000 votes to former President Buhari. They increased the vote share with over 100,000 in the 2019 elections. But in the last elections, they could only pass through They could only, even when the son of the soil was on the ballot, come up with just a little bit over 500,000 votes itself in these elections. But the INEC result viewing platform was actually the engine room of the elections, not even the BVAS. That was what was sold to everybody, both the locals and the international community. That was the modicum of integrity in this infrastructure. Nobody ever thought about the fact that it is being trialed for the first time in the national elections with over 176,000 constituency, as against the most where they had maybe 340 something wards in the Osun and the other elections. The numbers were never that large, but INEC sold a dream that, of course, boomeranged and is making it difficult to even talk about the elections, aside from the emotions, which the elections really was in a positive light. And I think the last, which is a lesson, aside from technology for all countries in the world, and this identity issue comes up across all of Africa, actually. It's beginning to define elections in different places, and we've seen it in Sierra Leone, where it's even more potent with ethnic bifurcation and political polarization commingling together. But the failure of communication, I think, is very, very key. Voters do not have a strategy on how to get information on elections. They largely depend on electoral management bodies and civil society organizations. But in that last elections, communication failed hugely here. And even when communication, there was not just a lack of strategic communication, but here communication was not a conversation between the election management body and the people of Nigeria. There was no conversation in that regard. And I think this failure of communication eventually defines the elections. While at every point in time, we have to start seeing, we have to recognize the fact that election is an emotional venture. And it is one, especially in our own climate, where our identity plays a very huge role, where it is about, it's not really about what people are really putting on the table. It's not about the manifesto, which we rarely see being implemented. It's not about the democracy, which fails to deliver development. It's more also about, this is my person. It is our turn. It is coming to this. It has to be from the north of the country, the northwest, the northeast, the southwest, the southeast. It becomes an emotional roller coaster, which if care is not taken, becomes extremely combustible. And I think it's enough time that we have to start zeroing in on these are key conclusions, some which can be addressed from an election management system, some which actually requires much more governance reform by the elected itself, while some will require even political reform, where we start seeing parties move towards institutionalization like that. Over. Thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you very much. I mean, listening to you, Adiat, reminds me of when we had Professor Yakubu of INEC here at Chatham House, and he gave this most marvelous speech. I mean, I was even convinced about how INEC would really rise to the challenge and the complexity of the Nigerian elections that he was planning for. And so he definitely, the prof talked the talk, but on the days of the elections and what followed, he didn't walk the walk. I mean, it wasn't just about technology that failed. It was basic logistics from what I saw. I mean, there was chaos in delivery of the equipment for polling units there was a currency problem. All of these things also contributed. Anyway, the next speaker that we have is Professor Nene Ifeanyi Ojukwu. She is an associate fellow here at the Chatham House Africa program, but she's also professor of law and technology at Leeds Law School. She has served as vice chairperson of the African Union Cybersecurity Experts Group and has been actively involved in advising the African Union Commission and African member states and existing international, regional, and national legal frameworks related to cyber governance and security. Prof, as we heard by Adiat, technology really disappointed. There was overblown expectations of what would happen and how this election would be different. And listening now back to the speech that we had from Professor Yakuba, did he put too much trust into technology? So that's one of my conclusions. He almost romanticized how it would deliver in a way that would kind of paper over the governance and other issues that we've just heard about. So let me hand over to you for some 10 minutes of reflection. Prof.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I also want to thank Hadiat for how she elaborately spoke about, the realities in terms of technology. I remember listening to the podcast last year before the elections when Professor Yakubu, talked about technology and of course, effectively talked about how the elections will be free and fair because, of the investment in technology. And I even remember shortly before the election, there were rumors about the jettisoning, the efforts to, discard the use of technology. And I remember him saying that the technology has come to stay and that they invested in it for the citizens. And how can we deprive citizens from access to results, elections conducted by them? But, one of the things I want to say, and just following the approach of Idiat as well, in terms of looking at the good side, I think Nigeria set out well, being the most populous nation in Africa. I felt it was an opportunity to set a huge example for Africa when the president signed the Electoral Act Amendment Bill. Now, in 2019, when the election was contested, INEC's defense was that the Electoral Act did not allow for the use of technology, and that was a blanket defense. But then, of course, that changed with the 2023 election with the signing of the Electoral Amendment Bill, which then gave INEC broad powers to deploy election technology and make technological advancements. And that changed the landscape of expectations for Nigerian citizens, because we then believed that with technology, at least this was a precursor to free and fair elections. But then, thinking beyond just Nigeria, many African countries are now deploying election technology. And one of the questions I tend to ask is, why are we deploying election technology? Looking at our realities on ground, why? Is it to ensure security and credibility of elections? Is it really for free and fair elections? Or is it merely because of the politics of development and the fact that, the global north, these are expectations of democracy, and then we do not look back at our reality and then ensure that we can actually deploy technology? And that, apart from Nigeria, you see across Africa, contentions that have come out after elections is usually based on the deployment of technology. Again, just after the elections, the then Minister of Communications and Digital Economy now said that in the run-up to the elections, there was threat intelligence that had revealed an increase in cyber threats, and that Nigeria recorded a total of 12.9 million cyber attacks. Now, when you think about 12.9 million cyber attacks, again, there was a question of, is this just an alibi for the malfunctioning of the BVAS or the malfunctioning of election technology in that sense? Again, like I said, this conversation shouldn't just be about Nigeria. I am more concerned thinking about the fact that so many other Africans are now coming out with election technology, deploying election technology in different forms. I think it is a basis for drawing examples rather than just having a mere blanket conversation about the deployment of election technology in Nigeria. Again, to the point Idiat raised as well, election technology was obviously a key factor to underscore the credibility of the elections. If you were to assess the preparedness for the election, it seemed like we were ready. But then at the end of the day, when you look back, it seemed that probably there was no preparation at all. And then the questions that I keep asking is, what then went wrong? It was hinged on electronic transmission of election results, misinformation and disinformation, registration and verification of voters, and even access to voters' data and protection of voters' data. Now, moving forward, how can we then ensure that we can secure election technology ahead of general elections in Africa? What can we draw from Nigeria? First of all, I would say that looking at election technology, elections are now classified as critical infrastructure. Rather than crying over spilled milk, how do we move forward? And Kenya was the first African country to designate election as critical national infrastructure. And I think that this is a basis for the African Union as well to think about, at a regional level, how do we look at the critical nature of elections and secure election technology on measures of cybersecurity? It would be good to see more harmonization at a regional level. Again, cybersecurity in elections is dependent on effective cybersecurity regulation. And last year, the Malabo Convention, the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity, entered into force. I am very keen to see what the region will do with the Malabo Convention. An election is very critical when we look at the coups and the conflicts happening in the region. We are also working on a continental cybersecurity strategy. And I think we must think about having a regulatory framework for digital technologies that are used in the context of election cycle. And that will mean focusing on cybersecurity and election data protection covered in an election-specific regulation, whether at the regional level or for national government. An example of this, if you look at the EU, for example, there is the Compendium on Cybersecurity of Election Technology, and it allows countries in the EU share experiences, provide guidance, as well as share tools and techniques. And I think that would help for African countries moving forward. I've seen so many reports. I've looked at the interim report, the Commonwealth interim report. And I just want to say that it is not enough to tell countries this is how you deploy technology without acknowledging the capacity, the digital capacity deficits. Now, one thing you would see with Nigeria, with Kenya, is that most African countries then deploy foreign companies, tech companies, to manage election systems. We are not certain with what happens to data. And sometimes when we argue that technology has not worked, many times you find that conversations do not tell you the challenges that are faced because of the lack of ownership of some of this technology. And I think as we move forward as well, it is important that we think about the ownership of digital systems, election technology systems, and what this will mean for voters' data and for management of the security of the technologies. Now, I would also add as well that looking at the system, the judiciary has a huge role to play. And while on one part, whatever happened with election technology, the politics of all of it all, the misconceptions and the apprehensions that have followed the election, we have to talk about the knowledge gap in understanding of election technology. Now, looking at the ruling of the judges, which of course will not be part of any report, at the end of the 2023 elections, when the candidates went to court, the Nigerian judiciary simply said that election transmission isn't mandatory. So what was the use of all the billions of naira, all the billions of money that was spent if it was not mandatory? And I think the knowledge gap is a huge challenge, and that is where there has to be a lot of focus. So much training is going on in terms of judiciary and cybersecurity. If Nigerians had insisted on deployment of technology and it failed, I felt that the judiciary was at a place. I had so much hope in the judiciary to make a statement or make a ruling that would mean that there should be a level of accountability from INEC in terms of deployment of technology, but that did not happen. And I wonder what that would mean, not just for Nigeria, but for other African countries as to how election technology will be deployed. Again, in terms of how data will be collected going forward, I think there should be more of impact assessment. This was not an issue with the Nigerian election. We didn't see that huge impact assessment. There was no open conversation. Like Idiat said, there was a breakdown in communication. Voters could not tell this was what was happening with voters' data. When data was captured, there was so much malfunction as well in terms of data and people's data that was being collected. Again, there was also questions of who the right authority was in terms of assessment. And I could draw examples from Kenya, for example, and Ghana. We saw during the last Ghanaian election that there was so much effort in terms of identity management. We didn't see that with the Nigerian elections. We also saw how Kenya worked with the communications authority hand in hand. And I think those are lessons we can learn even in the Nigerian context and beyond. As well as that, just to touch on the point Idiat had already made in terms of hate speech and misinformation, we saw political parties use pre-existing social cleavages around ethnicity and religion for election campaigns. This was a huge problem. And it was shocking to see how INEC addressed some of these issues in terms of misinformation and disinformation. There were no comments per se, broad comments to tackle hate speech, it was unclear who they were working with. There were so many civil society organizations working on their own. And I want to say that, talking about technology, free speech, misinformation and disinformation can actually hinder free and transparent, credible elections, and it's something that should be addressed. And finally, before I give back to you, Alex, I also want to say that the essence of election technology shouldn't just be about enhancing voting, but digital solutions should also make politics more transparent. It should be a basis to fight corruption and improve participation. If this is not the basis, then I do not see the need for deploying election technology if it is not to aid transparency. And we must also be careful and think about digitalization in terms of maturity. And that is where the digital transformation strategy of African Union comes in. And I think we should be clear about what we want to achieve in terms of digital transformation, particularly in the context of peace and security in the region, so that people are not disenfranchised through technology, so that we do not discriminate like what we saw in the rural areas during technology. And we can say that we are having free and fair elections in the near future as we deploy technology. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Prof. There's plenty there. I'll just say that when I was Commonwealth observer, my Commonwealth phone was overheating. It was burning up with the amount of fake information and manipulative information that all the political parties that I was in touch with were feeding me after the election days themselves. And we did try and pass information, collate it and send it on to INEC. But you're absolutely right. They're very ill-equipped to deal with this. And one thing is clear to me, that the responsibilities of INEC currently are too many, and that we really do need the establishment of a separate electoral offences commission in Nigeria. There is a bill for it, but that has been tabled, but it hasn't come to pass. And so too much was put on the shoulders of INEC. That's very clear in my view. Right, to broaden this out, to talk not just about Nigeria, but what are the implications of all of this in real time for ECOWAS, is no other than Ambassador Dr. Abdel Fattah Musa, who is the Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security of ECOWAS, at a position that he's held since July 2022. Prior to that, he worked in the Africa office of the United Nations Department of Political Affairs in New York, where he served as director for the West Africa division. And he's also had previous roles at the African Union. And indeed, he was previously at ECOWAS between 2005 and 2014. He's also worked for the not-for-profit world, including CDD, who in a long time ago, and also the Open Society Foundation, amongst others. So, Ambassador Moose, really good to see you. And if you'd unmute yourself, and the floor is yours. You need to unmute yourself, Moose. Or can we unmute you? Can we unmute?
I think
that's it. Okay, great. All protocols observed.
Okay. No, thank you very much, Alex, for having me on this very important platform, to discuss electoral processes in the region, taking a cue from a year from Nigeria. What have we learned? And then, all that. I think it's a very important, exercise. First and foremost, Alex, Idayat, and Prof, I want to contextualize it, not just to talk about elections per se. The issue is about the fledgling liberal democracy in Africa since the end of the Cold War. And of course, elections having been the key to exercising power and liberal democracy, in Africa. And taking a cue from, what Hidayat was saying, that elections in Africa, more than anywhere that I've observed, not even in the US in the last elections where there was so much controversy, that elections have become a do or die affair in Africa generally, and in West Africa, in particular. And that brings out all the challenges that have been raised by the previous speakers about the credibility of the whole process, and technology is failure or otherwise, in the region. The whole issue of identity, in the elections, on the continent. I think all these have to be contextualized within the whole process of state capture, in the region, and with election being the key to that, and that is why it is so. Nigeria is a bit different from many of the countries in West Africa that I have observed in terms of political parties and their identity, background, right? Nigeria has more party shopping, platform shopping than most of the countries in West Africa, and that is what we saw in the last election. The key opposition figure, had been a candidate or a contested for the candidature of all the two major parties before, in the country. And then you had the third party candidate of the Labour Party, who actually migrated from the key opposition, picker, the PDP, People Democratic Party, because also that he felt he had been cheated out of the candidature. So there is that fluidity in terms of the Nigerian political and electoral landscape, even though with a very heavy dose of identity, whether ethnic, religious, gender, and then others, and at times a mixture of all of them. That is one thing that I will talk about. And it is also very strange, that if you are going to analyze, and this is what ECOWAS also came up with, if you're going to analyze the Nigeria election and its impact on the region as a whole, I don't think I have witnessed any electoral process on the continent where the three top candidates all claim victory. And it had to go to the court. Usually you get the winner and the loser, just the first and second. But this time we had three candidates who all thought they were winners. So the INEC was saying that, okay, after all, we are right. So if everybody is contesting, let's go to court and then let's see, what happens over here. So this is, one point that I will raise. But generally in the region, when you are talking about technology and then the cost of elections, I said before, elections have become so instrumental in terms of control of power in the country, that there is no compromise in it, and that is what brings about the very high cost of elections and also the violence that is associated with many of these elections. Compared to Nigeria, you look at the other regions. Sierra Leone had the elections in June 2023, and we were there as observers, and there was a major problem. Sierra Leone is a very particular case in the West African scenery, political scenery, in that there is very little or zero cross-carpeting. And that also emphasizes the point that Idayat was making. There are two main regions of the country, the Mende in the southwest, the southern part generally, and the Temne in the north. Hardly do you see anybody from the SLPP becoming a member of APC, which is in the other part, or vice versa. It never happened. And that also brings about the winner-take-all attitude in it. But those are some of the downside of it. But me talking generally about liberal democracy, which is coming under serious threat, I will say one thing, that we have to look at some of the positive sides of it. Okay, through the electoral democracy and what we have in the continent. There was an analysis not long ago which found out that about, in terms of alternation of power in the countries up until about 1990, Africa experienced only one instance, I think in Madagascar. And since then, Africa has already witnessed about 32 alternations of power in one generation. Okay, and that gives you the positive side of the liberal democracy. The latest being what we saw in Liberia, which is also a very telling example. So electoral processes and their credibility is not uniform across West Africa, where I'm coming from. For every contentious elections, we had them in Ghana, we've had them in Nigeria, and eventually they ended up in the court and others, right? There were others like the case of Liberia, where against all odds, the incumbent president, even before all the votes had been counted, conceded defeat and congratulated the opponent, which was President George Weah, which is the beauty of democracy that we have to talk about. And now we have the situation of Senegal, in the country. I think you were raising, that issue. It's also tells you something, that the winner-take-all mentality is what governs elections. And a lot of the things that happened in that country was about a ruling coalition, a ruling party, wanting by all means to remain in power, even if without the president himself, who for efforts by others and his own thinking, decided not to go for a third term in the elections, and so he stepped aside. What other things that followed were actually this maneuvering. It was not about technology. It was not about the voter register. Their system was quite transparent, and the country is one of the most advanced when it comes to maturity in the democratic culture, generally that we are talking about. But talking about democratic culture, institutions worked. Institutions worked in the case of Senegal, and that the Constitutional Council made a ruling, and we've seen a few of such rulings, across the continent, where everybody has accepted, which is also a very positive, sign of democratization that we have to encourage. And in West Africa, I think there is one other point broadly that I would want to mention. It is the use of technology, not the use of technology in terms of ensuring the credibility of the electoral process or anything like that. And in Nigeria in particular, the conclusion of ECOWAS in the failure of the result transmission process and other things was that, and that is what I think the Supreme Court also came down to, is that technology was not used as the all and all instrument. Okay, and that because of the very nature of Africa, our very low infrastructure development, energy challenges and all that, there must be a backup. There must be a backup. And the question that we have to ask about Nigeria is, did the backup in terms of transmission of the election results in the presidential election, did they work or not? And were they part and parcel, even though you are seeing that the INEC chair, Professor Yakubu, sort of praised technology as the all and all, eventually it was the backup that was used. And, and that was it. So the question is whether that backup process was credible. And I think this is something that, we have to talk about. And also look at our some of our traditional uses. Today, when you are talking about technology, the Gambia is one country that has shied away from technology as a whole. In fact, the electoral process in the Gambia is based on barrels and pebbles. And then everybody, Tom, Dick, and Jack in the country, will vouch for the credibility of the process in the country. Maybe the sample is not as big as Nigeria, but it is something that we have to look at, that there are traditional ways of also, this, ballot that we can, electoral processes that we can use, like the example of the Gambia, where nobody has ever discredited the outcome of results in the country, except in the last instance where the incumbent lost and then he decided not to accept the results. That was in 2016. So we have to look at our backup, mechanisms, in the region, also to look at that. And the other downside of technology is the fact that, and I think the professor mentioned it when she was talking, I think Inena, talked about it, is the fact that most electoral processes, one of the biggest fear is the hacking of all the, the electoral process in order to manipulate results. It happened in Ghana in previous elections. It was a major issue in the last elections in Liberia, where so-called, the cyber guru had been hired by one of the parties to come and manipulate results. We've seen it happening. And so the thing is, we have to look at this downside. If the technology could be positive, there is a very negative aspect of it. Finally, Alex, maybe I can come back later on. What I want also to mention is the same technology about propaganda. In fact, when the crisis in Senegal, occurred, one thing that we observed was that the countries that had shunned the ballot box and then organized coup d'etats in their countries, that is Niger, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, they were actively campaigning, through disinformation and misinformation about the non-desirability of electoral processes and encouraging the military to take over because they want to increase their number. And this misinformation and disinformation was not carried out only by the countries, but some of the powers outside the continent who were actively encouraging member states and then the population to reject the ballot box, to reject electoral processes, and encouraging the military to come in, citing examples of where they think that electoral processes have been manipulated, elsewhere. And this is something also that we are looking very carefully at when it comes to the whole electoral, scene in West Africa. And finally, about institutions, white institutions, we know in Sierra Leone so far, in a place like Liberia and now in Senegal, despite the crisis, institutions are working. The Constitutional Council actually asserted its independence and its authority. We have to also admit that in most countries, the judiciary has been weaponized against the opposition, in electoral processes, and that is also something that we have to work very hard on to ensure the independence of the institutions in the country, whether it's the parliament, whether it's the executive, or whether it's the judiciary. It is very, very important, and the judiciary plays a central role when it comes to electoral processes on the continent. Yeah, so I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Ambassador Moose, thank you very much. So we have about 20 minutes for a conversation. I'm going to take a number of questions. and I'll kind of cluster them so that we're effective. So first of all, there is in the Q&A chat line, there's a question which I'm going to read, but please, some of you, if you want to write a question, do so, and I will try and read them or invite you to ask the question live. But the first one is Donald Eder is asking, why was the legitimate expectation of the people that the technology would make a difference thwarted? Was the election a failure of technology or governance or both? Why no action or no action on campaign finance laws? Very good question. And it's one also that I'm very aware that the Commonwealth Observer Group in preparing its report was reflecting on. There is a hand up from Nick Gill. Nick, we're going to offer you to unmute you and see if you want to ask your question. So Nick, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Yes, so I want to thank all the speakers for their time analyzing our last election. For most of us in Nigeria and the diaspora, the election did not meet our expectations. And I believe that there is a need for constitutional change and the electoral law changes to be made to make the elections better. So we will use 2023 as lessons learned to improve on the electoral process. And I have a couple of points. Number one, in Nigeria, we have what we call off-cycle elections. And off-cycle elections are elections where someone was in office and then the court took him out and then brought someone in, and then that person begins a term afresh. Even the office of the president is at the risk of being an off-cycle election. And the only reason why we have off-cycle election is because INEC decides to conduct election too close to when the handover will happen. So like in the last election were conducted in February and March, and handover is in May. And that doesn't give enough room for the courts to decide before people come into office. And when they come into office, they use the power of incumbency and the money that's available to them to fight the judicial cases as well. So why can't we have an election 6 months to handover or earlier, so that by the time people are being sworn in, the entire electoral process, including the judicial process, has already been ended? That's my first question. Then number two, I am a diasporan. I live in London. I'm speaking from London now. We have been yearning to have our franchise to vote made available to us. Why is the government stopping us? What can Chatham House and other international agencies help us to get diaspora voting to come on stream? I'll tell you what, if we are allowed to vote, the electoral process will become better, because in the diaspora, you cannot come and snatch ballot boxes. You cannot threaten people not to come out and vote, and we diasporans are not going to be collecting 5,000 to vote. So we're going to vote credible candidates. And if the diaspora can decide Nigeria's elections, so be it, because then we're going to get better candidates who will rule over the country. And then, of course, if I have some time, I would have dropped in independent candidature. Why don't we have independent candidature in our election? And then lastly, we talked about technology. The only reason that INEC used not to perform electronic transmission, especially in the presidential election, was that it's not part of the electoral law. It was just a guideline. So what can we now do to make this, to codify this, to make electronic transmission to be part of the electoral law, so that INEC will be mandated to do it? Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much, Nick. There is a lengthy comment by Ola Raju, which in essence, the question is asking, one fundamental flaw in my view is the absence of relevant institutions and regulatory agencies with powers to enforce the implementation of the so-called election technology. So Ola is particularly worried about the potential impact of artificial intelligence and how it can be managed. So that's another particular question. And I'll invite also Chi or Suji to ask a question, and then we'll have a round of answers. So Chi, if you can go ahead, we're going to unmute you. Go ahead.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody.
Yeah.
All right. Please, I listened to all the discussion, and I'm particularly intrigued by what Professor Nina and Madam Hassan said, and then probably also what Ambassador said. The two kings were very fundamental to me, and those, I think, are what is going to be able to determine future elections. If technology is to play a key role, then there is the likelihood that we have to get it right, not experiment. That is my point. Okay, there's no point. I think with technology we have to cut out errors. So we coming to start talking about technology being part of the error again means we are not moving forward. But I think if we deploy technology, there is a possibility that if we have an election that is fundamentally free and fair, technology should make it more freer and more fairer. That is what I see. Then secondly, what Ambassador Musa said, I think he mentioned something about the use of the judiciary, you understand, to against the opposition. That's what we have problem. Basically, if we can't get it right through the ballot box, we also have to look forward to the judiciary helping out. So there is no point in the judiciary being a tool in the hands of the winners of the election or the ruling government. That becomes a very big problem. So I'm asking, how do we cut out the errors from technology? There are not issues where we can be able to get the best out of technology and also get the best from our judiciary to make elections in this country better the way we expect it. That is, I think that's the beauty of democracy. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. So let's turn now. Idiat, do you want to go first? There's plenty there for you to reflect on.
Thank you very much, Alex. I think I start from the first question, which I think it's a mixture of the two. The real challenge, I would say, is trust, and trust in institutions actually played a very huge role in the legitimacy of the outcome of the last elections. And for me, every time I look at the elections, we base the analysis of the elections more on the outcome of the presidential elections, not the totality of the elections, which has brought bundles of gains that we should look at and plan against, like for the future, to show us that there is actually no impossibility. We only need a people committed to make this change to happen. Nobody would have thought that the Labour Party could have made such spectacular showing in the 2023 presidential elections. Nobody would have thought about it. Everybody thought they were just a party on social media. But we saw with mobilization, little money, they made those inroads. They won Lagos. They won in many parts, in the South and the southeastern part of the country. They won, and they won actually big in those areas. So I think that is very important. Then the issue is, when you look at it from a logical point of view, you find that technology was sold as a silver bullet. There were infrastructural challenges which we cannot at any point joke with: the bad roads, the bad electricity, the currency crisis, the failure of institutions, the corruption in institutions. All these then work together for what we saw on the day of the elections. And finally, we had mis and disinformation in fact, sorting facts from fiction became extremely difficult. And even currently, when you speak to people who are meant to be the analysts, top-notch, many of them cannot even see that we now have 9 political parties, active political parties in the country, because sorting fact from fiction is become extremely difficult for us. So we need a governance approach, an holistic approach, not just an electoral reform process, the way we have to talk about it. We need the people in themselves to change. We know there is poverty, but we have to move beyond vote buying as a means. So in Nigeria, all you need is to instrumentalize money, which is the vote buying aspect, and to actually instrumentalize violence. You can get yourself to the top in this instance. And when it comes to the specific issue on campaign finance, that has been a problem since the return to democracy in 1999. And that is one area where INEC does not have enough capacity in terms of dealing with it, and where the other parties, where the other institutions are not also supporting, because you have the EFCC, you have the Nigerian Financial Intelligence Unit, which you actually see suspicious movement of money, the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, the big money, not even the money that is being shared on the day of elections here. So I think we are not doing very well in this regard. When it comes to the schedule of elections, I think we have to realize that it's not by INEC's, I don't hold brief for INEC here, that elections are not held enough time to deal with issues of a petition. One, this is a constitutional and an electoral act issue. We have consistently advocated for the fact that petitions should be dispensed with before the inauguration of any person, because it's a corrupt system. All these people, they get into office, they enjoy the look of office, then after 3 years, they are now thrown out of office in the past. Now we can say that within 1 year, all the processes would have accumulated, but this should be concluded. So it's an amendment issue which we hope to push in the next, in the ongoing. There is now an ongoing amendment process, and that INEC actually gives notice of election 1 year before, but there are 14 activities that it must actually conclude within this 1 year. So some issues are constitutional, and for diaspora voting too, it falls in that remit, really. And it's also important that when we make some of these amendments, we don't end up making amendment like what we saw with the BVAS, where, of course, the BVAS and the IReV were very important, just like the card reader were very important. But it is not the means of actually determining the outcome of the elections. So the lawmakers, of course, they think only also of themselves. It's about state capture. One of the captive institutions, when you look at elections, is always the legislature as much as the Electoral Commission itself. When they make laws, they give with one hand, they take with the other hand, because the fact remains that the form EC8A still remains the valid point of actually determining the outcome of an elections, which the argument will continuously be that every polling agent of the political parties have a copy of this EC8A, and they are able to bring it, they are able to tally their own results and determine if they won or did not win in the last elections, and of course in all elections that are held. Thank you.
Thank you. Prof, so much is about technology, and Ambassador Abdel Fattah Musso mentioned about the importance of backup, not to be over-reliant on technology.
Yeah, thank you again, Alex. I think it's important we also compartmentalize these issues. And there are two issues here, that of extant reality of governance approaches in Nigeria, and then technology on the other hand. And the key question is, are we used to having free and fair elections even before the deployment of election technology? If we're not used to boasting of free and fair elections, then I doubt that technology would have made any change whatsoever, because technology in itself could also be a frontier for fraud, for election fraud. It could also be a tool to disenfranchise citizens. And I want to say that I think if we've agreed that we would use technology, backups are good. It's important to have backups. And that is why I asked in the beginning, are we digitally mature to the point where we really want to use technology? If not, can we still have free and fair elections? But then if a country has said we are doing something beyond backup, citizens wanted accountability. Citizens wanted transparency. Remember, so much money had been expended for this, and we wanted to see this being used, even if the heavens will fall. That is why it is important that leaders are held accountable. But again, to play the devil's advocate, we must also remember that elections are capital intensive, and developing countries tend to suffer so much when you think about digital issues. And so having an ambition for technology doesn't necessarily mean that we set out to fail the system or that it was thwarted. And of course, there were this alibi of hacking, cybersecurity, infiltration, issues with cyber attacks, which of course the government said, but that again is not actually so much of an excuse, because then there could have been other measures to show that indeed there was a focus on transparency. The times when BVAS or when results were being uploaded, those sort of issues did not need that much of technological challenge as was being posed at the end of the day. But then again, what was the approach to curtail some of these issues? This is what people were asking. Even if technology had failed, how much of accountability was shown? It was so much of a disregard. Remember, there was also faith in the judiciary to interpret the fact that the Electoral Act, and it simply said INEC was not mandated. And that is where, again, I feel the judiciary failed Nigerians. And if you think back to the Kenyan elections 2017, it was such a bold move for the Supreme Court, based on the irregularity of election technology, to annul an election where an incumbent had already won. I don't know if there is such audacity to be seen in Nigeria at any time, but then the judiciary could have done better. The other thing to say is, talking about time, the gentleman who spoke, who talked about the timing of elections, I think it's something that shouldn't be disregarded. It's actually important. If we are at a point where we say we want to use technology, it starts at the end of election cycles. At the moment it ends, we begin to think about the security, the consciousness. I don't want to see a Nigeria that comes back to tell the same story of failure of election technology in the next 4 years. I don't think it should be forgiven with what we saw in these elections. This is the time to begin the constant assessment of potential threats, thinking of what companies to use, what election to build. Should we have indigenous technology systems? Who and who should be involved? Are we changing the people in INEC, who obviously may not have the right training? In the last elections, we didn't see INEC even train party officials. They were not open about trainings. We never saw when INEC invited stakeholders from other political parties to familiarize them with the election technology transmission system ahead of the elections. Even when people went to court, the opposing parties went to court, there was no accessibility to technology or the freedom or openness from INEC to allow them access electoral election technology systems. And I think those shouldn't be repeated as we go forward. Thank you. You're muted, Alex.
Muted, yeah, sorry. Thanks, Prof. What I'm going to do is take one more round and then allow panelists to pick and choose what they want to answer, and then we finish, because we're now moving on to borrowed time in 1 minute. So first of all, I'm going to invite Remy to ask a question. Hello, Remy. We're unmuting you. Please go ahead. Remy, are you there? Otherwise, we move on to next person. Okay, so let's move to the next person who's got a question, which is Susan Fajana Thomas.
Hello, can you?
Oh, Remy, go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, my point is that thanks. Actually, when I couldn't get through, I put the question. It's about this issue of quality of the Nigeria political party system itself. When we talk about which all the speakers have spoken to about this monetization or monetization of politics itself. When you look at it, the primaries as well, the problems which we've been having about this issue of carpet crossing emanates from the primaries itself, given the fact that you tend to see that the primary criterion for leadership, as opposed to competence and the vision and ideology, is no more there. It's the issue of loyalty now, primordial loyalty or godfatherism, or how much wealth you can carry. And in such country, if we tend to see that, it means those people that are even qualified, that they have no place. And more often than not, we often see that. And how do we address this? That's another question. Possibly is another area that we need to look at about this party financing, about issue of monetization. We've got a lot of vote buying in nearly all the states. And even EFCC caught some people in the federal capital. So what I'm just trying to say is another area in which we tend to need to look into. Thank you.
Thank you, Remy. Next person we're going to unmute is Susan. Go ahead, Susan. We're unmuting you.
Thanks very much, Alex, and thanks to the panel for their contributions. Just observation and one question, really. Idayat, you mentioned something around similarities with the Nigerian 1979 election. I'm interested to find out what those similarities you observe are. And one thing that I know many of the speakers seems to be criticism of the election, which is acceptable as a politician here in the UK. I know the importance of credible elections in democracy. But having said that, one of the things, Nena, you mentioned was around the use of technology and the acknowledgement of digital capacity. I haven't seen your recommendations. I think that is one of the main challenge we have in Africa, not just in Nigeria. Just yesterday, I wanted to call my mother. Twice I got cut off because of networking issues. So without most of the complaint with the use of technology was the download. There's no downloadable, the form are not being not coming through, which is again part of internet and the capacity to deliver technology. Just wondering whether that would be part of your recommendation, because there's no point using technology if the technology is not going to work, and if the capacity of the technology is not in the hands of Nigeria or INEC or the government. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. We're running out of time, so I'm just going to summarize two other questions, and then unfortunately we'll have to go to our panelists for final observations, remarks. So Kieran asked the question, if turnout is so low, how, what's the chances of turnout improving? And I suppose I'll add the question to Ambassador Abdel Fattah Musa on, are you worried about electoral turnout in other elections in West Africa after such a super low turnout that we saw in Nigeria? And then Valerie Smith asked the question, it's 1 year on, how's the Nigerian government doing? So that's her question. So we'll go again in the same order. First of all, Adiat, we'll invite you for final remarks, then Nene, Prof, and then final remark, Ambassador Abdel Fattah Musa. Adiat, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think, one, we have to note that elections do have similarities, and similarities are not just in historical, but they are also a regional thing, really. For the Kenyan, the Nigerian elections, in fact, the elections are beginning to look more like the same with each elections, because politicians are learning from the other. They are learning, they are instrumentalizing what works in one part of the country, in one part of the world, in their own climate as well. And specifically to the issue of the 1979 elections, which is quite interesting. One is that in these last elections, we had 3 formidable candidates from the 3 major ethnic groupings in Nigeria. The last time we had that was in 1979, where we had Azikwe, we had Shagari, and of course we had Obafemi Awolowo, with another fringe candidate, of course, the PRP, who also played just like the NNPP candidate from Kano in that elections. We also had this fractious environment where ethnic rule, but most importantly, we had what was the definition of 12th to 3rd, which came up in these elections about the status of Abuja. Then 12th to 3rd was because we had 19 states. Now we have the 36 states plus the FCT. That how does a winner emerge in the elections, which was one of the most contentious issues in these elections, considering the winner of the election did not win the Federal Capital Territory, Abuja, and one of the issues that was determined in court. But I think what we have to do is we have to start looking at elections beyond the prism of election management only. The more we continue to view elections just from the prism of election management, I think that we would be challenged. Election management is just a part of the problem of the elections, of the challenges of elections we are actually witnessing in Africa as a whole, not just in Nigeria. The nature of politics is actually driving the electoral outcome here. The weaponization of identity, either you look at it in the last Kenyan elections, in the Liberian elections, which was positive for us, in Sierra Leone elections, in Nigeria elections. Yeah, we know in Ghana, one ethnic group cannot win. But this is a consistent dynamic in elections. The use of violence, the role money is actually playing, the overlarge role of technology, both electoral technology and the weaponization of information in elections. Information is now a weapon, like a gun, which you can actually just shoot into the polity and everything can actually burst. The bubble can actually burst for us. Thank you very much, Alex.
Professor Nena?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I just want to say that election technology is important as a closing, but the security of it all is even more important. And I've heard, reading the charts, people saying, then why don't we stick to manual? And I think that the technology is not the problem. It is our governance approaches that is the problem. And even if we went back to manual, if we are not used to having free and fair elections, it would not happen. If we are a country that does not underscore the value of free and fair elections, election technology will not make a difference. But then, like Susan pointed out, this conversation even throws up the more bigger issue of digital infrastructural challenges in Africa. It is not just Nigeria. We have issues of cybersecurity, we have issues of digital identity, digital economic issues. It is not just elections. And I think the African Union has to be more transparent with its digital transformation strategy approach. I do not see election as one of the cross-cutting themes, and I think it's something that has become very, very important. And I think that as we move forward, this will help to build confidence ahead of future elections. But I think the key issue is understanding that elections are about people, democracy is about people. And if indeed elections are for the people, even if we use or we do not use election technology, it has to be with a focus on transparency, accountability, and free and fair elections. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Moose, over to you.
Yes, thank you. 3 points. I agree with the questioner who asked about the electoral dispute resolution. And I think he had a point. And I'll point to Ghana in 2018, where electoral dispute went into almost the second half of the presidential term in Ghana. And reforms had to be introduced to make sure that all disputes were resolved before the elected president takes office. So I think it is important to have a thought about that. In Sierra Leone, it was one of the main causes of the challenges that we had in Sierra Leone recently. After the June elections, the president was declared the winner and sworn in barely 6 hours after that. Barely 6 hours. And, so the opposition decided that we are not even going to waste our time going to court and other things. And then they boycotted parliament, boycotted all governance institutions, and ECOWAS had to go in to try with African Union in the first place to go and try and resolve this issue together with our Commonwealth counterparts. So electoral dispute management is important. The timing is very, very important as well. Next, we're talking about technology and then this winner-take-all attitude and all that. Alex, what I would want to say is that elections are not rigged on election day or after. elections are rigged through the electoral cycle. Okay, in particular, constituency redemarcation is a source of gerrymandering, which parties have to monitor very closely. Voter registration exercise is another place where there can be disenfranchisement and others. So for me, the ability of political parties to police their vote and to police the electoral cycle is the guarantor for more credible elections as we go ahead. The final thing I would say is that somebody asked the question about the lack of enthusiasm in voting and then things like that. I think it is also linked to what is the value added of elections, particularly in people's lives. It is very, very important, that because of the winner-take-all attitude, the monetization of elections across the continent generally, representation becomes very skewed. We have some progress. If you take West Africa, the parliaments are becoming multicolor, not monocolor, which is already an advance on, as far as liberal democracy is concerned. If you go to Sierra Leone, the parliament is almost 50-50. You go to Ghana, the parliament is about 50-50. You go to Sierra Leone, the parliament is about 50-50. So the parliament is gaining in maturity and being a proper check, even though bribery and corruption still affects many of them. But it is progress nonetheless. So I think, broadly speaking, we must look at our representation. How do elections ensure inclusive governance? That is, for me, the key element. The winner-take-all attitude is making, is ensuring that so many segments of the society are disenfranchised and marginalized. So we have to look at all systems of government like proportional representation and others to bring into the electoral system in order to make it more acceptable and more inclusive and more attractive to the broad range of the the social element that we have in our community. I think, I'll end there. Those are some of the 3 points I would want to mention in terms of conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. So I'm not going to sum up anything. I'm going to say thank you to our 3 panelists. This has been a really rich, robust discussion. I'm going to promise that if anybody wants the Commonwealth Observer Group report on Nigeria, as soon as we have it, we'll send it out to those who indicate that they want it. And certainly everybody who's on this list, who's registered, will get it. And if there's anyone in the London area, we do have the Foreign Minister of the Transitional Authority of Gabon tomorrow talking about their timetable to elections. If you're interested in attending that meeting, send me an email. We have a small meeting tomorrow, pushing a military junta, in fact, to talk about how they are going to return to constitutional rule. So with that, I want to wish everyone a good afternoon. And for those of you from Washington, because I've seen a few of you are online, a very good morning, and keep well. And thank you for joining this webinar on 1 year after the Nigerian elections. Thank you very much, everybody. I will do a clap for everyone. Thank you very much.